Welcome to the Venture Black podcast. On this episode, we're joined by Kwame Boler, the co-founder of Spritz, the app made for modern house cleaners. He's a graduate of Techstars Seattle 2020 class and was part of the inaugural class of the WTIA, which is the Washington State Technology Industry Association's accelerator. He's an operator for Outside VC and has advised many startups. We are also joined by Lance Mason. He's a CPA, worked for Ernst & Young. He is the editor-in-chief of Rise Over Run. Through Rise Over Run, Lance leverages his storytelling ability to demystify accounting concepts and paint an inspiring vision for the future of the capital markets. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
Hey, thanks for having
So
us.
to get started, I was wondering if you could tell us kind of how you started getting into the startup landscape and a little bit about your history before then. Maybe we could get started with Lance.
Yeah. So I started basically, I got exposure to private companies when I worked at Ernst & Young. And essentially after leaving the audit environment, I worked at a few startups, and that was kind of the initial moments that led to my insights for wanting to start something on my own. Really, there was a problem that CPAs were encountering, specifically me as a CPA, that I wanted to figure out how I could go solve. I was listening to a lot of content about startup founders and the moments that they had to go and start their own thing, and that was really the inciting incident. So it really started with that and wanting to help CPAs to be able to show their subject matter expertise outside of their own organization. So yeah, that's where it started for me.
And how did that lead to the beginning of the Rise Over Run Substack series?
Yeah, so so Rise Over Run, the publication that we have on Substack, really was an extension of something I've always loved to do, which is write. And I joke that even though I'm a CPA, like most of my time outside of doing numbers is writing words. And so, I've been writing for as long as I can remember, and being able to clearly outline some of the insights that I had as a part of doing my work as a CPA was something that I found was very valuable. And then, of course, I attended a panel that Kwame was on, and then he and I collaborated on a data series about investing in underrepresented founders.
Yeah, we'll definitely talk about that just at the recent South by Southwest startup series. And then, so Kwame, what's your background originally, and how did you get into the startup ecosystem?
So I got my degree in computer engineering from the New Jersey Institute of Technology. What moved me to the Pacific Northwest was the Boeing company. I'd originally interned with the company consecutively. The summer sold me and ended up moving myself to Seattle, where I lived for 7 years. At the very early junction, I'd already dabbed in entrepreneurship. I started building companies as early in college. Nothing that amounted to any material success, but ended up getting into real estate relatively early. And then from there into property management, specifically for corporate housing contracts through vacation rentals. And this was at a time to where that wasn't really that popular. And so we were able to easily penetrate and scale just by leveraging like that as a vehicle to get tons of properties within the Seattle downtown area. And we couldn't find a cleaning company that could keep up with us. And so that frustration later led us to building a tech enabled cleaning service called Tidy. And it was through that experience that we understood a lot of the pain points that local cleaning businesses face, and specifically with servicing Airbnbs and vacation rentals. So we then pivoted to building New, a which was a marketplace like an Uber for Airbnb cleaning. But and we'll go on to that story and journey a little bit later. But then from there, we later pivoted again to building the back office solution for residential contractors, specifically with house cleaners as their beachhead, which is.
And so you started off as Tidy and then did a brand change to New. And can you tell me a little bit more kind of about those early days?
Well, Tidy actually came as a subset of another one of my company's biggest pain points. And so while I was employed at Boeing, I was looking for passive income as a means to be able to escape the chains of like enterprise job. And that's when I wasn't alone. Me and a couple of my closest friends had come together and we built Seagate Investment Group, which was like a real estate property management investment entity. And it was also the vehicle in which we used to secure our corporate housing contracts. And our biggest bottleneck was cleaning. We just couldn't find cleaners that could keep up with us. And so Tidy, in that first instance or iteration of business, was actually something that we got out of Aboda's playbook. For those who aren't aware, Aboda is like the one of the largest corporate housing like companies in the world, and specifically within North America and the United States. And so anytime that like any large enterprise organization like a Microsoft, Google, Boeing has interns coming in, they work with Aboda, who then kind of navigates all the logistic challenges of those short-term leases and also additional services within it. And one of those bigger services that they had was a wholly owned subsidiary called Aboda Cleans. And we thought we could penetrate the market and remove our second largest operating expense because we recognize that pain point firsthand. And so we thought we can leverage technology as a means to manage our staff. We were wrong. Tens of thousands of dollars later of bad cleans, like staff quitting all the time, and our ignorance kind of coming back at us, we then discovered that we were not the right guys to pick up the scrub brush, but we could at least empower those individuals, leveraging technology as a vehicle for them to be able to scale their own businesses. And that now that we understood both their pain points and also the pain points of vacation rental host, we could operate as that perfect conduit or that middle ground between the two and facilitate exchange between both parties really seamlessly.
And so, when did you guys formally kind of like go into incorporation? And what was your first move? So you began in the WTIA's first cohort, and then
Yeah.
got into TechStars. And so, at what point did you realize that you needed to go through an accelerator, and what kind of choices precipitated that?
Yeah, it was interesting. At that point, we were really green. So we were just looking for anything that can educate us and get us access to more capital. Like TLDR, we had no background in venture. Like, especially with new, that pivot happened while I was still working at the Boeing company. I felt chained to the desk. Like, literally each day that I was going into work, I felt like it just was like really hurting the opportunities. And new was really explosive. So that pivot directly from tidy to new is where we saw a lot of traction gained, like where we recognized that in being the facilitators, we could scale. And as we saw the revenue growing week over week, we just were in a position where we knew that we were on something huge and we needed to focus on being able to dedicate full time to it. And so my co-founder, Rowan Wall, like who was with me there, was the only person that transitioned directly from tidy to then working on new, was also agreed. He put in. I had already made plans of leaving Boeing in July because I was getting married in August, and so I knew that hey, like I need that extra time and that bandwidth, and this was like an actual time to exit. And I was also going through some things personally with my family that was giving me the need to kind of take a break and kind of slow things down and be able to focus a little bit better. And it was after I made that transition to going into full time that it continued to grow and scale. But even still, it was in a position to where it couldn't properly compensate either Rowan or I based off of what the salaries that we were generating both at Boeing. And that wasn't the ambition. It's like we entered with the ambition of having some form of personal burn rate and being able to minimize some of our own expenses so that we could focus on it. And that was the investment that we opted to make. We saw programs like WTIA as vehicles for us to be able to get access and more exposure with an industry because we just genuinely did not know what we were doing. And the irony was that by comparison to most venture backed startups, we were doing really well. Like from a revenue standpoint in Seattle alone, prior to joining the Techstars Accelerator, we were generating about $250,000 annually in just that one city, which is really not common. And like even now, today, it's considered rare, but for technical startups in general, it's still not considered to be a common expectation in terms of revenue traction. And so we were a very mature company. We also didn't get into Techstars our first time. Like we got really close our first time. Christopher and Aviel Ginsberg were the co-managing directors at the time, and they just hated the company.
Mm.
Like, they weren't big fans of the problem that we were solving. They didn't like the scalability of it. Both of them, especially Chris, was really quick to acknowledge that he thought that myself and Claudius, the other co-founder of New, who later joined as our second CTO, were the ones that were really built like the nucleus of the team. But he hated the fact that we were married to this problem. He didn't see or have a vested interest in it. And part of the reason why we had gotten so far was under the thesis that they can convince us to build something different or transition into something that was a little bit more scalable. Um, and we didn't understand it at the time. And so when we applied the second time around, we thought, we'd 100% get in, because at that point, our revenues had more than doubled what they were previously. So it was like, hey, not only are we working, but we figured out more scalable ways to deeper penetrate the market that we're in. But they're like, oh no, it's like, you guys doubling down on this. It's like, it's paying homage to how great you are as an entrepreneur, but also equally how we just don't like the way that you're solving this problem,
Mhm.
nor are we that attracted to it. It was actually Isaac Kato that was the one that gave us the chance. And he was the first managing director of Techstars Seattle to inherit it post Aviel and Chris DeVore standing down. And Isaac was pretty excited, and he thought that the concept was very novel. He thought that the way that we were solving it was very unique. And he was really attracted to the problem that we were solving just as a whole. So
Yeah, he's a great guy. He runs Two Ravens now. It's a great early stage VC firm here in Northwest. So Kwame, in terms of different media that we have that like kind of covers like Black founders or just venture and folks from Black diaspora within it, have you found any good kind of media representations? As we're kind of getting started with Venture Black, definitely want to look at prior art of getting stuff out there. You spoke about GeekWire and some of the good press that they generated. And so I was wondering if you could talk about your experience kind of getting reviewed by Taylor Soper and those folks and Todd Bishop, I think, from GeekWire. And then also any other kind of podcasts that you found that are useful to go through and look at Black Founder Journey.
yeah, so there's a couple. First off, love John, love Todd, love Taylor. I love the GeekWire team. They've been phenomenal assets to both my own development and journey, and I'm very grateful of how kind they've been and opportunities they've extended through both network and fellowship. And so they're amazing guys. They're an amazing team. It's really just great energy, and they're great people to kind of connect with. And I really appreciate how they elevate the Pacific Northwest. And they're one of the few media outlets that I often exclusively talk positively about. And so very grateful for them.
And they covered New when it was had first raised. Is that right?
Yeah, so they covered us. They were one of the first outlets to cover us when we closed our seed round. They also covered the pivot. They were the very first release press when we pivoted to Spritz. At that point, Spritz didn't even have a website, and we didn't even have a logo. We were just like, we had announced it in our update, which a good portion of the GeekWire team follows. And so once we announced the pivot, they were like, yeah, we want to write a press release on this. We're like, okay, let's get a website up. And they're like, you have a day. We were like, we wanted them to do it in a week. But they were like, you have a day. And so I was like, okay. But I've always appreciated the challenge and just how they've navigated that story. It's just like really, really, really wonderful people. Outside of them, podcast wise, interestingly, a couple come to mind, like Dan Kihanya with Founders Unfound. I was actually in episode 2 of that series, and I've been a regular reoccurring guest. I think there's like 3 or 4 different recordings that Dan has had with me over the years, and just like he was one of the first, both within Seattle and just quite frankly overall, to kind of highlight with a specific focus on founders within the African diaspora, and just very grateful and very appreciative of his brand and just continuing to elevate our stories and narratives. Another one is actually one out of Texas called Entrepreneurial Appetite. And while it's not limited exclusively to Black founders, and there's like Langston has primarily had a large portion of Black founders represented on that podcast series. And its theme in centralization, because Langston himself is a college professor that really parlayed into entrepreneurship and wanted to introduce some of the parallels and insights and learnings in ways to kind of curate and like build more founders as a whole. But he himself has done a couple of really, really good episodes, or actually a large portion of his episodes are really good. But I'm thinking particularly of some unreleased that I've had privilege to, and even my own episode. I think I ended up breaking a couple records for him that year. It was one of the highest listened to episodes, which kind of was disappointing. Not the fact that it wasn't disappointing, but at the time that I had discovered that, we were going through like something within the company that was really disappointing. And so like I wasn't in a mood to celebrate that.
Mhm, mhm.
Um, and it took me like even like me running into him in circumstance afterwards saying like I'm really grateful and thank you for the exposure, because I don't think I did the best of just saying like, thank you. Like I appreciated the opportunity, and more importantly, how you elevated our brand and how it gave me the freedom and the space to speak on that, to speak on what we were building and the value of it, as well. Actually, yeah, no, there's a couple too. I'm thinking of a good friend of mine. Her name is Esther. Esther did the High Performers podcast, which was really interesting. It really focused primarily not just on athletes, but just like a lot of entrepreneurs actually used to be athletes, whether professionally
Mhm.
or at the very least recreationally. And so there's a strong correlation there. And while I do not identify, um, there were a lot of really interesting discussions and habits that came out of that one. So those are the top three that come to mind outside of what you're doing with the Venture Black podcast, Evan.
There's a good one out here in the Puget Sound too that I got to shout out. Ed Barker does a podcast called Sound Investments, which is aiming to chronicle the stories of all of the VCs in the Puget Sound
Mm,
region. And so I did an episode with him not so long ago, and was able to get a great episode that he'd recorded with Pack Ventures and a few other folks as well. So it's worth a good listen for folks that are here in the Puget Sound that want to know
is he?
about.
Does he have a ponytail?
No, no, well, not during the time that I've known him.
Okay,
He's I think from the UK,
never
and
mind. I saw recently another episode series to where you were featured on a podcast recently. Um,
oh, that was Jason Cavanis. Yeah,
yes,
exactly. We
yes,
got
it
to
was.
shout out Jason too.
Yes,
Jason, his format is excellent, and he's probably one of the most prolific podcasters I've met in terms of getting, really great folks on. And so, yeah, he's, if you want to know who's who in kind of like the Seattle ecosystem, he's more than likely had them on his podcast as well.
interesting.
Yeah, does great work. And he has a HR company as well. So met him, I think, working with kind of leaner startups out in Bellevue, and then connected with him at a CellNet party around computer network stuff. I was ex network engineer, software developer stuff. So I got to go to that and check out what he'd been doing there. Yeah, but yeah, exciting. And Dan from Founders Unfound, he's also the VC CVC
REI.
for REI.
Yep.
I think it's Path Ahead Ventures.
Yep.
And yeah, they've done amazing work in terms of developing companies focused on the outdoors. They have an accelerator too
Yep.
that focus on companies that have a focus on outdoor recreation kind of stuff too. So some great founders have come through there that I've met in the Portland and Seattle ecosystems. And so when you get up to that 250K revenue, kind of you say within the first year.
Oh, wasn't first year. Sorry, like bad on spanning timelines. And so to give you guys some context, 2015 is when Segan was created. 2016 was when Tidy was created. 2017, and specifically January of 2017, was when New was created. Tidy only lived for less than 6 months. So it was like the summer of 2016 is when we introduced that concept. 20 we didn't get into Techstars Seattle until 2020. So we applied 3 times. And so and in 2020, when we got in, we were already generating close to $250,000 in annual sales. And so our revenue had consistently scaled year over year, and pretty considerably. Like year one, we had done like maybe I want to say like 20K a year, mainly shorter year, but still like $20,000 in revenue in first year operating. And that was as tidy. If you want to look at news first entry revenue was give or take, if I recall correctly, maybe like 70K. Year two, we were doing about 160K, and then year three, we were doing about 250K.
Okay. And so, Lance, you started encountering private companies that were kind of following trajectories like this, or would you like at what entry point would you start interacting with private companies? And did you start kind of while you were at Ernst and Young working at companies at this scale, or were you working with like larger private companies, but then maybe saw a need to work with kind of people that were getting started, or some blend?
Yeah. So as a CPA, especially when I started in doing accounting services on my own outside of uh, the previous firms that I worked for, I started seeing a range of different experiences from founders. So all the way from I just have an idea and I participated in a pitch competition and I have some money and I may have made some expenses on my own and I have to figure out how that works from a tax perspective, all the way up to founders who had small businesses that were looking to grow who maybe knew of some technology solutions that would enable them to do so and needed help getting tax compliant. And then also some startups that were really starting to ramp up on their ability to scale. And usually, I think just in generally, just speaking broadly, I've seen that scaling component and the need for additional assistance happening between like the $1 million and above range. That's really when people have gotten a lot of traction. And ironically, not necessarily ironically, but amazingly and impressively, other founders that have figured out ways to figure out growth without necessarily getting funding in the traditional ways that most startup founders are aware of at the early stages.
And so, at what point did you and Kwame's stories start to intersect?
Yeah, so I attended Afrotech. I believe the year was 2023. It all kind of blends.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah, so Afrotech 2023, Kwame was on a panel that was hosted by Wilson Sonsini, and I had heard uh, a lot of the phrases and the ways that he articulated the challenges of founders were comments that I had felt as a founder, but hadn't heard anyone else speak to. And of course, because I was aware of a lot of previous examples of startups, not just in my own practice, but outside of which, when I was just learning on what it would take to become a startup founder, there were gaps in that I think a lot of Black founders ended up experiencing, and just me speaking in particular, that weren't necessarily making their way into the larger narrative, especially into a lot of the content. And so the publication Rise Over One was a starting point to be able to articulate those things. And then when I heard Kwame speak to a lot of those challenges, I thought that it would be amazing for us to work together. And really, it wasn't even that specific about us working together. It was really, he mentioned that he was open to passively supporting founders, and I think that was a really big sticking point that a lot of founders miss out on. Like, there are a lot of branded companies that we know and love today who didn't do it on their own. And I don't even say just didn't do it on their own, but also got advice and also passive support from others in their network.
Mm.
And Kwame was the first person that I heard say that succinctly and describe all the ways that could happen. So to take a step back, I recognized the influx of like new information that you get after speaking at a panel, right? Like, you may connect with a lot of people, and of course, they want to figure out how to work with you collaboratively.
Mm.
And so knowing that, and this is kind of the strategy that that has worked well for me, was I wrote a blog post responding to Kwame's comments and shared it with him and said, listen, I will not publish this if you do not want me to, but I think that our framework for understanding entrepreneurship is the same. And, tell me if I'm on base, and if not, let me know. But I felt pretty confident about that. And I think that was a point at which we got on a video call. And
Yeah, no, and like to piggyback off of it, like Lance is a phenomenal writer. And there are instances to where I notice I will speak with double or triple entendres, and it's often lost to the audience. And there was one in particular that he had caught, to where like I sometimes will incorporate music into like my vocabulary as I'm describing it. Like I'll say that founders need to build a sounding board, like as an instrument, as a means to be able to understand like what's music versus what's noise, collaboratively to be able to decipher like whether they're doing things that are meaningful versus doing things that others will find to be harsh. And I believe the entendre was around like baseline. I don't remember exactly what it was.
yeah.
Yeah, but I think it was. And then he had caught it, and I was like, okay, this guy's really clever. Like, because like not like to toot my own horn. It just, so I'm not always intentionally I've done a lot of public speaking, and sometimes I feel as if what I'm saying is not always received. And I could tell that he really did. And I was already at a point to where I wanted to collaborate and work with someone who could be very intentional on helping me bring something to vision. So another part that kind of fell in between was that same year, or actually, no, it wasn't the same year, the following year, I'd spoken on a panel specifically within Austin. This is when DEI was still sexy, and was not as taboo as it once was. And it was a topic that was done in Austin at the Capital Factory, done by another accelerator that I often support called Div Inc. And the panel was specifically on some of the new laws that were being introduced in California, and what that would mean. The requirement, of course, being like to outline both the ethnicity of portfolio companies that have been invested in order to kind of get a better track on where dollars were allocating and why. And while everyone on that panel was very distinguished and an expert over a wide variety of industries, there was a question that I was asked that perplexed me. And I think that it was fair to evaluate. One person in the audience had asked me, or one of the biggest articulations of the death of affirmative action, which also coincided with that panel, because that also happened that year within the Supreme Court, and that had gotten shut down. And that was also a central topic of that panel, was the thesis that affirmative action was working, and that the reason why it was working was because quotas were being introduced, and those quotas were representative of the people within the population within each of those different idiosyncrasies or groups. And that by maintaining those quotas, you saw significant change and evolution within the businesses themselves, to where now there's arguments to be made to whether affirmative action is still needed and necessary. But then when it was first introduced, it was very much so. It just was this an effective solution. And so her argument was that quotas similarly need to be reintroduced within the VC ecosystem as a measure to be able to effectively know whether or not organizations are operating absent of bias, or ways to combat some of the subjectivity that goes into the decision making of who to invest in and why.
And this is California Senate Bill 54, that was the Fair Investment Practices by Investment Advisors Act.
Yes, that's correct. And so she had introduced that, and then someone had asked, because we had seen and heard this stat consistently, less than 2% of capital goes towards instant demographic here, but generally in that panel, it goes towards Black founders. And the question was, well, how much should there be? And no one could accurately answer that question. And even I myself was in a position where I was like, I don't have an actual good answer for that. And when you look at it from a media perspective, no one did. Like, no one was responsibly investigating this as a thesis. Everyone was kind of perpetuating this narrative to where, boo-hoo, Black founders are undercapitalized. And it's not just Black founders, but Hispanic founders and female founders and LGBTQIA. But no one had the solution, so to speak, or at least rather the North Star of approximately within ecosystem or within market, how much should there be, and is there parity? Is there not parity? Why is there not parity? Where is the room for us to explore this? Because we can't solve a problem that we don't fully understand.
Right.
And that's where, I had spoken to Lance about this, and Lance was already kind of game. And he thought that this would be a pretty interesting topic to explore. And to your point, Evan, you had mentioned this earlier, but I think you had misinterpreted the panel because now it's all coming together. Like, the pinnacle of this was that we actually got to present this data on the stage of South by Southwest.
And that was just this last year.
And that was just this last year. And so we had spent a year analyzing, creating proxies, talking about it, introducing narrative discussions to meaningfully not just disrupt the narrative, but effectively to introduce an alternative, and to ultimately develop understanding as to why. Because I think that if we're leading the narrative from a negative position, then you're doing nothing but planting a seed of doubt into the mind of any investor. And from a founder's perspective firsthand, I've shared this with a couple of people, and much more in my earlier days than I did now. But at one point, 1/3 of investor conversations that I would have would be people kind of almost negging on my ethnicity. Like, for some reason, my ethnicity would come into the equation and not the merits and accolades of the business itself. And to some degree, it wasn't the matter of me being, new to the industry and not really green and understanding how to, play the game or have the right network or have the most resources. The general assumption was that he's not raising because he's Black. And that was a really frustrating situation, let alone circumstance, to have to adapt to. Because in many instances, I almost felt the need to combat the ideology of, okay, like, realistically speaking, I am not under resourced because I am Black, and is nor should my ethnicity be really coming into the equation in terms of the conversation that we're having on whether or
It
not
was
it's a viable
maybe
business.
kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy that you were trying to kind of break that cycle of,
Exactly.
and then creating that data set to kind of create an alternative to that prevailing kind of a conversation topic around that less than 2%.
Yeah. And ultimately, I wanted to be a part of the change I wish I could see. If not, like I've heard that if not you, then who? And I've also seen and been in enough rooms to where, like, you recognize that the deviation between brilliance and genius is more minimal than you'd assume. And so I recognized that the only difference in action was indifference. Like, people just weren't feeling the need to actually invest the time to do this. And, Lance and I had that interest, had that passion. And we had the success of being able to work with a couple of really dedicated volunteers that chose to, like, elevate the brand, sacrifice their time, help us with the research, like, find and identify the right panelist to have this discussion in the right stage for this discussion to be held as well.
So when you were going through the data sets, like, what were the closest um, numbers that you could find from existing reports from maybe like McKinsey or Accenture or anything like this? Or even I think there were maybe a few different Crunchbase reports on this.
No.
What was the closest existing report that got closest towards kind of the ethnicity breakdown?
Yeah. I would say maybe specific for Black founders, there's a paper from Columbia that is, last time we checked, was under peer review, that really looked at the how many Black founders were at risk of raising capital versus how much capital that they raise. That was the most comprehensive study across the U.S. that was found. But in order to find that study, it took several months. And of course, if need be, we can talk about some of the AI tools that we use to be able to triangulate and find that study. But even earlier than that, we leveraged Crunchbase data, we leveraged PitchBook data. We also leveraged the McKinsey study where possible. And that showed the most data in terms of a breakdown between overrepresented founders and underrepresented founders. However, we needed to kind of layer on data from Zippia and several other data science reports that were published. And it got to be kind of like an arts and crafts project in terms of where one person would finish, we have to find a different source of data. I remember we found something from Deloitte about that gave us a proxy for the number of female founders that are building in tech. And then we kind of use those to figure out what the percentage breakdown of our data was. But I remember specifically the PitchBook data being the most comprehensive. And so what I mean by comprehensive is it was like the most consistent and ground truth that we were able to leverage for the rest of the research. Like, for example, they have a dashboard that shows how much male founders and female founders got in venture capital over several years. And so this allowed us to compare to some of the other sources that we got to get to a number that we were able to kind of project out to round out the discussion at South by Southwest.
That was kind of like the Rosetta Stone that kind of tied everything together.
Yeah. And I will say there were a lot of other insights that were acquired just like even as we investigated. Like ultimately we had come to the conclusion that the data that we had produced was a good starting point, but not effectively mature enough to where we could say this is definitive, at least in the sense to where we could say like these are good approximates, but these are not precise. And we recognized that we would need more mature partnerships as well as more tools to be able to get that level of precision that we would want. There was a lot of also interesting insights that we had unlocked just from analyzing the data that was really, really compelling as well. But I think ultimately it was a really good project for us to sink our teeth in. And there's a lot that we're excited with coming into this year in terms of how do we take it to the next level, but more importantly, how do we get more precise with this? How do we leverage this data as a tool in order to truly benefit the people that we are describing and attributing within this ecosystem? And what are some of these biases? Why do some of these biases exist? How do you combat some of the biases that exist?
And we've had really great traction. We've got 4 portfolio companies to date, which I got to give shout outs to. So Doppel Technologies that has a telerobotic ultrasound product that they've been developing, and they just got through their clinical trials where a operator of an ultrasound probe was sitting in a basement in Spokane, Washington, running an ultrasound procedure via its robot in Leavenworth, Washington, in good old Germantown out here. And then our second investment is from Bay Area, which is a fintech company called Remint, which is a credit repair company that we thought had a great business model, especially considering kind of the current household savings and the current loan situation being a little crazy. So anticipate people needing credit repair opportunities there. And then in the most recent round, which we're just getting to close on, we have the Wink Therapeutics, which has an RNA-based therapy that is a potential cure for type 1 diabetes that locates beta islet cells that are the insulin producing cells in the pancreas, helps regrow them, and then also defends them against attack from the autoimmune system. And then the last company that we was very close to being our primary investment is a company called Kahek, which is a marketplace for nurse preceptors, which are the nurses in the healthcare system that are tasked with training up nurses that are graduating from or intending to graduate from university programs. And so only 1% of nurses actually take it on as an activity because they're not well incentivized financially to do it. So it leads to this weird scenario where universities can only take as many students as they can place in clinical rotations with these preceptors. So it slows down the whole flow of healthcare professionals in. So by creating a gig economy marketplace for nurse preceptors to get paid more fairly for their time and the professional risk they take on as the nursing students work under their license, by getting more predictive funding opportunities through the universities themselves, it creates like a better flow for our healthcare system. And this is a global thing that happens even in the UK's National Health Service and different things like this. So it's applicable globally, but we're really excited about, these first four, high impact companies and that are, brilliant technical founders. Every one of these founders is just some of the most amazing, professional folks you could ever want to meet. So, but that's enough, bragging about portfolio companies.
Yeah, I was like, wait, great shameless plugs. I'm happy to actually be an investor in one of them, and so I participated in Fund One, and I'm actually a very small investor in Doppel, and so I'm pretty excited to see what they're doing and how they're scaling.
Yeah, it's exciting. We'll be putting out more of those reports. We've got some report automation tools we just are instituting as a part of this round to help as we grow and scale. But I wanted to conclude with the final question, which is, what piece of advice would you give to someone that is, breaking those golden handcuffs from working in, a professional field that wants to go into starting their own startup company? And Kwame, if you could kick us off there.
Sure. I think the first piece of advice would be contrarian to what's often said in industry, which is a lot of people tell you to quit your job. I actually tell you that I'm very adamant about the opposite. I think you should moonlight for as long as you possibly can. Taste before you bite, test before you build. And especially if you happen to be in a position where you work remotely and for a company that has a pretty generous and novel remotely, there's a lot that you can do like policy before you exit full time. Like you can never take time. Don't get me wrong. Your job at points may feel as if it's a distraction, but it's a healthy one because it's going to keep the lights on and food on the table. The second thing I would really advise with a buddy or a friend, just depending on the social relationship, it could be a bit of a distraction. But if not, it could be, again, a great way for you to test because that relationship is very similar to a marriage. Like you're entering in with this bond and this expectation of, spending the next 4 or 5 years minimum of your life on this, realistically closer to a decade, sometimes a decade and a half or two, on this venture. And so you really want to be able to build trust and confidence in each other and the capabilities. Last two pieces, life runs in parallel. A lot of people think that life stops the minute that you decide to run and start a company. It's the opposite. Some of my most painful life experiences happen in parallel to me operating and running a company. Even more recently, my aunt passed away in December, and it was really hard for me to be able to focus, let alone continue to operate in a capacity that I needed for the company, keeping into consideration that this is one of the few people in my personal life that actually understood and valued what I do professionally and could grasp it and understand it and converse with me about it. And that was something that was treasured and is very much missed. And I was not alone. My co-founder, Claudius, at one point while we were raising capital, his father was dying from cancer. And I'll never forget that he was literally writing code while his father was on his deathbed in hospice. And these are the moments that aren't really well talked about, like the challenges of being able to prioritize your personal relationships and maintaining them too. And so I guess with the life runs in parallel, I'll end with this is a marathon, not a sprint. And so it's imperative that you prepare for being in this race for as long as you possibly can be, and within clear means to be able to make this even feasible, to give your opportunity the best chance of success. And it's not just for you, it's for your co-founder as well. From a financial standpoint, if you can figure out ways in which you can reduce your cost of expenses considerably, that's huge. Like really pinpoint where you're spending money, analyze it, understand, set budgets, and be realistic with those budgets. So that way you can ensure that you're being able to maintain them. But and when I say realistic, it's also recognize some of those habits and some of those behaviors may not change. Like if you're a regular Starbucks user, you may want to avoid Starbucks and make coffee at home because you recognize the cost differential is significant. But you may also get other hidden joys and pleasures from going to Starbucks and interacting in that type of environment. So it just may mean reducing the frequency from daily to weekly could be something that you have to factor in. Plan for vacations. Like you should be factoring in like taking time off and being able to afford to take time off without it feeling guilty for taking time off. Like if you're in a position to where like you're going to want to do a vacation and go somewhere, that should also be incorporated into your budget to where you're setting aside the money to be able to actually focus on investing in yourself and your career. Um, Similarly, conferences, conventions, other padding you want to do for like if you can, like I advise a lot of founders to get rid of any reoccurring expenses. Like one of the most affluent people I know in my network drives like a 99 Subaru hatchback. And you would never know that he has a net worth that's like in the like 8 figures, 9 figures. Yeah, it's like he's ridiculously wealthy, but you never know that. Because because of how he chooses to move and operate that. But I say that to say you're going to want to get rid of any reoccurring expense. Like another good friend of mine, or not good friend, but someone that I've recently become acquainted with, he's like, yeah, I don't buy vehicles unless they're 10 to 15 years old because that's where I maximize the depreciation of the asset. It's like I just need a car that looks clean that can get me from point A to point B.
Mhm.
If you own that, you've just reduced your insurance premium. You're not in a position where you're paying a car payment. Like it's that
Yeah.
level of decision making to where you're wanting to reduce expenses as much as possible. Like at one point I considered house hacking, but I was married at the time, so I guess I had a permanent roommate, so it's a little bit different of story, which also made a difference in terms of the resources I had at my disposal. Like I would not be able to do what I do as a founder if I did not have my wife as a partner, like hands down. My wife is a high earner, and like in combination with her being a high earner and a lot of really important decisions that I made,
Mhm.
like in my youth, and being able to become a homeowner at, I think I bought my first home when I was 23 or 24 years old, and was able to sell that home to then liquidate hundreds of thousands of dollars as a result of it, really made a lot of the difference in my ability to have access to the same lifestyle without being able to get access to the same reoccurring means. So yeah, it's like the discipline. You really want to get in those habits. You can go on trials too. Like before you even start, put in your 2 weeks
Mhm.
notice. You can even try to see if there's ways in which you can exercise a break or leave of absence from your company to then be able to see if this is really what you want to do before you do it. Because you really need to be bought in. If you're not bought in, then it's destined to fail. And it's not just you, it's your entire co-founding team. Like they have to be bought in. And if they're not, then this is just, a self-fulfilling prophecy. Like this, like a lot of people get into this industry under the gauge that this is something really cool and really novel, and they think it's all going to be like Silicon Valley, and they're going to have
Mhm.
their middle out story that then leads them to becoming affluent and having discovered something. But in reality, the vast majority of people who enter this industry know that the failure reality is considerably more probable. So you have to be really vested to the idea and the concept and the problem that you're solving, because
Mhm.
you're effectively recognizing that you're entering an industry to where failure is much more probable of outcome than success, and that you're choosing to enter that industry and defy those odds because you suspect that you have a team that's capable of manifesting that success. And so again, just make sure that a part of that success story is being true to yourself, and being true in ensuring that you can maintain those relationships. Like it's imperative that you build a network, not just the founders that you can have fellowship with, but also that you don't completely sabotage your current network too. founding a company can be very isolating. And as an earlier entrepreneur, I ended up killing a lot of personal relationships by focusing almost exclusively on the development of my company under the impression that it would get me to the finish line faster, to then later learn that, I did ultimately put myself in an isolated environment to where I had to then repair many relationships of trust over time that are still being repaired and have not gotten to where they once were. So I guess that was a really clever way of making it seem scarier than it is, because it's beautiful, it's fun, it's addictive, and if you're doing it right, you'll truly enjoy yourself. But your ability to be able to make your dreams a reality are those 5 P's. That proper preparation does prevent the poor performance. The amount of money, like if you can give yourself 18 months runway, great. If you can give yourself 24 months runway, even better. If you can give yourself 36 months runway, ideal. If you're not at a point to where in 36 months you're not able to generate some form of income or offset, then you really have to evaluate what you're doing. And it may be time for you to either adjust either the problem that you're solving, or potentially go back in the industry, take a break, come back.
Yep. Well said, Kwame. Yeah, that's great. Passion and revenue are the things that are going to sustain you. Well, this is great. Yeah, thank you so much for being on our inaugural podcast episode here, and appreciate your time.